people are led to believe that the job I'm in is that. It's going to be the job that I'm in for the future. And I think none of us has that luxury anymore because, no one's ever standing still, right?
Yeah. And haven't for decades.
Right.
What would happen if we just told the truth?
Welcome to TruthWorks, where we dig into the nitty-gritty of leadership and work.
And what needs to change. I'm Jessica Neal.
And I'm Patty McCord.
Our journey together started in HR, but trust us, it's evolved into something wild, honest, and a bit rebellious.
So throw out the handbook. We're here to redefine rules to work for us, not against us.
Let's dive into another episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of TruthWorks. I am Jessica Neal, and I'm here with Patty McCord, of course.
Hello, hello.
And today we have a very special guest, Ravin Jesuthasan. And he is an author of many books, but has a recent book out. And we're going to get into a lot of stuff because, your studies and your work are just really fantastic. So I can't wait for our listeners to kind of hear in. But why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us how you stumbled into all of this stuff that you write about and work and future and skills. Tell us the story.
Well, Jessica and Patty, it's lovely to be here with you. And thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation. So I like to think I have kind of what is increasingly, I think, a stereotypical portfolio career in the sense that I run a large consulting business for my employer. I run the transformation consulting business globally for Mercer, which is part of Marsh McLennan Companies. I'm also on the faculty at Caltech, along with an executive development cohort called the Fast Future Executive. And my passion is research and writing books. So have written 6 now. And the way I kind of got here was very strange because I'm a former strategy consultant who I like to think of myself as a retreaded finance guy. I'm a chartered financial analyst who found his way into this people thing, right? Very strange. But I think the sweet spot was applying the decision science that kind of underpins strategy and finance to how we think about the way people work and the way work is experienced. And so that really has been kind of the golden thread that has kind of cut through my research, the work that I do, both in terms of my day job and my night jobs, as well as the thread that has cut across the 6 books that I've written.
Yeah. So take us back a little bit to, you're this analyst finance guy. And then was there like an aha or something that happened that kind of pulled you into the people side?
Yeah. So when I first, right after I got my MBA, I joined what was then Towers Perrin, which today is part of Willis Towers Watson, and was doing a lot of work around equity analysis and rethinking the way value was created and measured. And then ultimately people were being rewarded, and really found my way into executive pay. And over time, found that to be fairly limiting because it was like, well, we're focused on the 2% of the people who, yes, they make all the big decisions, but what about the other 98%? And I had this belief that real value was, yes, those M&A decisions that are made by the 2%, very important. But every day, those 98% are making $5,000, $10,000 decisions every day of the week. And how do we better shape those decisions? How do we ensure that there is alignment to those decisions? How do we ensure that those decisions are being shaped and people are being motivated in the right ways, they're being organized in the right ways, their work is being architected in the right way. And so that's kind of what got me interested. And the opportunity to not view that 98% as this big mass, but the opportunity to be a bit more surgical in thinking about work and the workforce. And that's what got me really excited because I saw the connection to these methodologies and tools that I'd learned in finance and strategy and being able to adapt them for the workforce at large.
It makes such sense. It's funny because Jessica and I both started our careers as recruiters, so we get that Towers Perrin connection. Mm-hmm. And we kind of went the other way. right? We started in that and then got into more business and more finance and understanding. I think what you're talking about is something that really resonates with us, which is the context around how the entire workforce behaves, not just the way you incent the people at the top. And we could do a whole show on just executive compensation and pay. And so then you take that, right, and you start looking. What changed your view to start looking forward? I mean, I love that you can call yourself a futurist, because I think that's a really cool job title. My first favorite job title is mountain manager, but that's just like, I think that's really cool. But how did you get into the most recent stuff where you're really looking ahead?
Yeah, and I started working with the World Economic Forum in 2015. It was in Davos one year that someone actually sort of used that phrase in a public setting to refer to me. And it was because so much of my research and what I was writing about was about, what was going to happen next. So, I started with my co-author and good friend, John Boudreau, writing about our first book was about the use of decision science in how people are managed. It was called Transformative HR. And then the second book was around how work was rapidly escaping the organizational boundary with the use of gig workers. And it kind of foreshadowed the arrival of all of these external marketplaces that we now take for granted, like Instacart and Fiverr, etc. And so that was our second book, and it really laid out for business leaders, how do you actively manage and govern intellectual property and the engagement of this talent, because they're going to be a critical part of your mission, beyond employees. Mm-hmm. And then our third book was around, back in 2018, it was published by the Harvard Business Review, was around the impact of AI on work, which obviously we're now feeling in spades, but we showcased then and developed a framework that is now used by many companies to think about, how do I introduce Gen AI into organizations and how do I redesign work for these emerging technologies? It becomes a bit of a flywheel, Patty, in the sense that, when you've pushed the envelope in one direction, you want to keep looking at what's going to come next and seeing the discontinuities, because I think it's easy to extrapolate a trend, right? And to me, what's interesting is to look for the discontinuities in the world of work. And so that was the third book. The fourth book, John and I wrote, was about how do you distill all of these discontinuities, these changing ways of work, into a new operating model for organizations. And it was called Work Without Jobs. It really, I think, broke some new ground, and in showing organizations the exponential amount of productivity and value they could unleash by bending the demand curve of work in a fundamentally different way than how we thought about it, and bending the supply curve of work in a different way to make work more accessible to a lot more people, to bring them into the game, and so concepts like stars that you guys are both familiar with, right, in terms of accessing that non-traditional talent.
Yeah, when researching, I love that book and that concept, but can you tell an example of that?
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing I have to say, I'm in this incredibly privileged position because as a consultant, I get asked in to work with these amazing companies to help solve like some really interesting and challenging problems. And so they become my petri dish, right?
Right.
To be able to experiment with them and test my ideas and perfect them. So I'll give you a couple of examples. One is Genentech, Patty, in your neck of the woods, really progressive organization. Alexander, their CEO, Cynthia Burks, their CHRO, at the height of COVID, actually at the start of COVID, rightly saying, this is not a little blip that is going to be with us for 6 weeks and it's going to go away. This is the start of a fundamental change in how we need to think about work and the flexibility with which people engage with work. And so I had the privilege of working with them to actually develop a framework that would guide leaders in thinking about, back then, when do I need to be on site versus not? But it became much, much bigger than that. It became not just about where work was done and when it's done, but what's the work itself? How is it done? Why is it done? And that framework, was baked into the book, and it really allowed Genentech, I think, to be much more progressive in thinking about during this pandemic and more importantly beyond, how do we design work so that people can connect to it as seamlessly as possible with as little friction as possible? And then equally, how do we make work more accessible to a pool of more diverse talent that maybe is not present in the Bay Area?
Mm-hmm.
How do we think about re-architecting work and distributing it so that we can make our mission more accessible to many more people? And so that was just a neat story. It was in the first chapter of the book. The other was a very large global retailer who was introducing automation into their distribution centers. And the initial premise was that this automation was going to reduce their headcount and save them labor costs by some 20%. In actuality, it ended up increasing their labor cost by something like 10% because they had to do all this triage around this technology. And it was the perfect proof point for a point that John and I have made a number of times in our books, that you really need to lead with the work. And you can't get seduced by the sexy new technology and think, I'm going to stick the technology there and it's going to replace the person who was doing the work before, but rather understanding, where does that technology substitute? Where might that technology augment that person, making her super productive? And where, frankly, does that technology actually create new work, new opportunities? Because there is a need for someone, very simplistically, to install the machine, to calibrate the machine, to operate the machine, to maintain the machine. All of that is new work that needs to be created. And so how do we, again, redesign work and optimize for this technology? And that was, another neat opportunity to sort of, again, test out thinking and ideas.
What was something you hypothesized would happen, but you were wrong?
The thing that I thought would be easier, Patty, was my good friend Gary Bowles talks about mindset, skill set, and tool set. The thing that I hypothesized would be a little bit easier was the mindset of business leaders. And it actually was the basis for a quote that has been used by many people now, which is legacy, which used to be, particularly for established organizations, right? Their primary source of competitive advantage is actually increasingly the millstone that hangs around the neck of that organization and its ability to stay relevant for a changing world. And probably most prominent in terms of legacy beyond the infrastructure and processes is the mindset of leaders, and breaking that mindset to say, you know what, new work doesn't mean I go open a rec and I call TA.
Right.
New work actually means I take a step back to think about, how do I redesign for all of these options that I have, and then partner with TA to figure out how best to resource.
I love that.
I do too. And my experience is that it's like, and see if this rings true for you. The executives get it because they architect it, right? The new people in the organization that you hire to do the installation, maintenance, all that stuff, they get it. It's the middle, right? It's the folks who got rewarded for tenure and for being experts and having, the legacy wisdom, right? I sometimes said, institutional knowledge is probably really helpful in an institution.
I love that.
but if that's not what you do for, business, then, you might want to rethink that. And that's how we started this context, right? Man, it is hard to change the people who have gotten where they are because they did what we've always done.
Yeah. And I find that this goes to the top though, too.
Yeah.
Right. It's not just the middle. It can go.
Well, because that's often how they get to the top.
Right. Exactly.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
With these changes, the top has a lot of influence and say on what, how, and when.
And they tend to freak out when it goes south.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right? Like
Quickly.
you make the big decision, you make the big financial commitment, everything's going to be wonderful. And as soon as what you're talking about, wait a minute, this is costing us 10% more. hold everything,
Yeah.
bad decision, got to backtrack. So how did this lead you to tell us about the new book? Tell us about the future.
So from Work Without Jobs, the thing that jumped out at us was the need for, in this world of accelerated velocity of change and volatility, the need for a much smaller set of building blocks that could be pulled apart as things changed and then recombined for new opportunities. And what we kept seeing was that this thing called a job was just increasingly too inefficient, too calcified in the past. Now, I'm not saying jobs themselves are going away, but a need to shine the spotlight on the core building blocks of a job. And essentially the skills and capabilities that were being required by the work and the skills and capabilities provided by the talent that was doing the work. And the ability for, in this more machine-augmented world, to recognize where skills are being rendered obsolete when the work is being substituted, where they are changing in application because they're more machine-augmented, and what new skills are being demanded, and ensuring that that we're giving talent the visibility to that changing narrative, because so often people are led to believe that the job I'm in is just that. It's going to be the job that I'm in for the future. And I think none of us has that luxury anymore because, no one's ever standing still, right?
Yeah.
And haven't for decades.
Right.
And so with that, tell us some stories around who's doing that well, what happens when you don't do that well.
Yep. So this book, the sixth book, is actually quite different from the last five because, and I'd say this somewhat tongue-in-cheek and with all due respect to my co-authors, but my co-authors were either John's an academic, one of the most esteemed academics in the world, and I'm a consultant. And I often say to John, neither of us has a real job.
Uh-huh.
And so I wanted to write a book with someone who has a real job. And so my co-author is the chief strategy and talent officer of one of the oldest banks in the world. And the thing that was always intriguing to me, I've known Tanuj for about, 4 years now. We started collaborating at the World Economic Forum in Davos about 3 years ago. We've sat on multiple committees and do panels together every year. And the changes that she was making were really in sync with, some of what I'd been writing about. We certainly had a kind of a shared worldview. And so what we wanted to do with this book was write a practitioner's guide. So really have it be a guide for business leaders and HR leaders to fundamentally re-envision work. And that's what we tried to do with the book. If you've had a chance to read it, you'll see that every chapter starts with some of the theory and some of the research, but goes very quickly into real-world examples of how she and her leadership team at Standard Chartered have been able to make these changes. We've also got numerous other case studies in there, but being able to tell this running narrative across all of the 9 chapters of how they've gone on that journey and how they've sustained it and the impact that it's had on their business. And changing, 170-year-old company is no mean feat.
Yeah, no. And often doesn't happen.
Yes, exactly. So their ability to sort of transcend that legacy, right, was what was really intriguing to me.
So what was it about them that allowed them to do it?
I think it was a combination of a couple of things. One was they had a really solid business case, an economic case for change. They had leaders right through the organization that bought into it early on, beginning with the top. She really did the hard work of bringing that middle along, Patty, to your point. So for 3 years, they've had these monthly people leader calls. It started off with, maybe a couple of hundred, tens, maybe 20 or 30 people would join. And today, all 5,000 people managers actively participate in that. They've changed the culture to have, to do something that we've been talking about a lot, which is to design in space for learning in the flow of work. And they've made this issue of skills and their skills passport kind of the currency for how work is done. And Tanuj often says, some of the most cynical people in the world are our corporate investment bankers. today, 80% of them have skills passports, and they are actively being deployed to work in new opportunities in areas that, they maybe would never have considered going into, but it's where the opportunity has led them to. And so this openness to change has been fascinating to see. But the thing, that was mind blowing, go back to my first point about the economic case. It started off with this one number that she showed the board, which was that as we become the bank that is going to finance the transition to net zero, we need to basically move our talent en masse. And we can save 50,000 British pounds per employee by reskilling talent from our sunset roles to our sunrise roles, as opposed to doing what we and everyone else has always done, which is I do a big restructuring over here, fire a bunch of people with legacy skills, and then go out and build something new here and hire a bunch of people with the new skills and pay above market premiums because everyone else is chasing those same skills. And so we could actually save, 50,000 pounds per employee. How do we now create this journey map? And so the fact that there was this big number, 50,000 multiplied by several tens of thousands of people, got the board excited, and it became the impetus for this entire change journey.
That's fascinating.
Did the numbers pan out?
They did. It is fascinating to see how the thing that to me is really exciting, Patty, is not just the primary impact, which is that one number, but the secondary and tertiary impact, because those are orders of magnitude greater. The agility with which they now operate. She's got this one great example, which is in the book. They were, in the course of business planning, this idea of becoming the first bank that would provide deaf-friendly banking in India was floated because it was a large unserved population. It was economically viable, but that project got, shelved because there were other priorities. And so the person who initiated it said, you know what, I'm going to go ahead with it, and posted a project onto their internal marketplace and asked for volunteers from around the world. So you had a person who does DEI from New York sign up. You had a data scientist from South Africa sign up. You had a marketer from Australia sign up. And they basically stood up this new product in something like 6 months. And today it's generating millions of dollars with zero investment.
Wow.
I mean, zero fixed costs, zero, sort of investment. And that's the thing that has been really fascinating to see, is how, again, this culture is permeating the business, and it's allowing them to expand and grow and, increase their productivity in ways that they never could have contemplated.
And, here's your co-author who's, a talent person at one of the world's largest bank in HR, transforming the company. But we were talking earlier before we got it started recording about how in HR that sometimes is rarely the case. And you talk a lot about transformational HR. What do you think it is about the function or the leaders of the function that prevent innovation or change?
Yeah. What are the principles that everybody still follows that just don't work anymore?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll go back to that point about legacy, right? And I wrote a paper for the World Economic Forum with another amazing leader, Lena Nair, who used to be the CHRO at Unilever, who's now the CEO at Chanel. Lena and I wrote a paper for the World Economic Forum called HR 4.0. And we talked about the pivot of this discipline, profession, and function from its legacy of being a steward of employment to increasingly being a steward of work. And if you think about the legacy of the profession, right, going back to probably 140 years ago when this profession was institutionalized, not to go back to that word, Patty, but
right.
It became sort of professionalized. Maybe that's a better word, professionalized.
Personnel.
Yeah,
Yes.
personnel.
Yeah.
But it was all about, ensure what, some might call the silent running of the enterprise, right? Ensure I have enough people with the right skills available at the right time and at the right cost. And that was, so it was kind of, for want of a better phrase, a compliance function, right?
Yeah.
Ensure that the business can run. And then as work changed, work globalized, different cultures, changing demographics, the introduction of automation, the ask of the profession, started to change. But I think it's really accelerated the last, I would say, 20 years or so, just because of just the velocity and volatility of change. And frankly, the opportunity for HR to, I'm not going to use the seat at the table phrase, although I just did, I guess. But the opportunity for this profession to really shift from being, I'm going to make sure that you've got enough resources, to I'm actually going to help you orchestrate work and the human experience of work. And that's the strategic thing. And I think that challenges, so many HR leaders just struggle to pull out of the compliance piece, right? Because you're stuck in service delivery hell.
Yeah.
And how do you pull out? And you guys obviously did it. I look at some of my friends, Diane Gearson at IBM, Diane did it, Lena did it, Tanuj does it. But the problem is, these are the superstars of the profession, right? So they are the exception rather than the norm. But they are these bright, shining lights that I think are helping to pull the profession along, just like you guys did. But I do think there needs to be more institutionalized change. But I also think it goes back to so many business leaders who, still are stuck in that mindset of that's the box you sit in, right?
Yeah.
I think it's a both and, I think it's very hard to get pulled out of the service center, if you will. But I think also leaders don't know how to value the function outside of that. And they do kind of box them in. But at the same time, they want them to be more strategic, and they want them to be, more the thought partner, but yet they're not. I don't know whether not allowing, that sounds more severe than it probably is, but maybe don't know how to let them be that person.
Yeah. And I think it works both ways. I mean,
Yeah.
You did say seat at the table, and I still hear it. And I have two responses to it. One of them is you're waiting for an invitation.
Yeah.
Right. Like, well, that's never going to happen. Right. So you want the table to not be complete unless you're there. Yeah. Right. I knew that my role had changed when somebody's like, wait a minute, before we get going on this merger, get Patty in here. Right. I mean, it just wouldn't even occur to anybody to do something like that without having me in the room to help orchestrate that. And the other one is, I personally think that we HR people in particular have developed a language that nobody understands but them, and they don't speak business. And so, I mean, the stuff that you've been talking about with the amazing leaders that you're talking about, they're talking about business transition. They're talking about cost effectiveness. They're talking about, things that affect the P&L and how the business and how the customers and how the, survival of the entity in the future goes. They're not talking about policy.
No.
Right. I mean, so I want to just touch on one thing that I want you to explain to our listeners. Tell me about a skills passport.
Yeah. So let me sort of back up as to why I think a skills passport is necessary. In the book, we talk about 3 core capabilities of the skills powered organization. And this goes right to your point, Patty, about starting with the business. It's about, do I understand the changing demand signals for my organization? Can I translate that into what that means for the work we do? And can I link that to the skills required to do the work, whether it's the capabilities of the machine or the skills of the talent that's going to do it? Do I then understand what skills I have in the organization and frankly beyond? Right? With workers outside the organization, do I understand the skills that my managed services provider can provide versus the gig platforms, etc.? And can I architect work? So what we call work design to get to that, to actually connect the two. That's the first part. The second part is, can I then close those skill gaps at scale and speed? So not just doing development for the sake of development, but development that is strategically anchored in the business. And that's why I love that Standard Chartered example, because learning and development was not something HR did. it was part of the strategic plan because it was going to close this big gap in their operating model. And that to me was really critical. And then the third leg is because we don't really want to do development for the sake of development, good as that is, but it has to generate that economic return that we projected. And so can we deploy skills back to work, whether it's in a job, in a full-time job, in a flexible model with these internal marketplaces, or increasingly as more companies embed agile across their operating models in these flow models where people are connecting to work through projects and assignments and gigs ever more seamlessly. And so those were the three anchors. And to come to your question, the skills passport, it's a digital implement that continuously gives me signals as to how the demand for skills is changing, how my skills match up, and the gaps that I need to close in order to be eligible for different opportunities to grow and develop. And the thing that's really exciting from a talent management perspective is that it takes us out of these binary conversations of, I've got to move up into my job's boss, but oh dear, she's only 40 and so she's never going to retire. Or I can move laterally, into this other role, into
right. The ladder.
I've got millions of opportunities to grow and develop. And, now we have these, what are increasingly called squiggly careers, right? I think of it as a bowl of spaghetti, as opposed to a lattice, if you will.
We have just enjoyed this, and thank you so much. I mean, all of this, I think, will be a lot of food for thought for our listeners. And we'd love it if you joined us in a career confession.
Mm-hmm.
This is from one of our listeners. Should I ask my company to cover a course that will make me better at my job? I've been thinking about taking a short course to develop skills that could really benefit my role in the team. The course isn't super expensive, and it's only a few weeks long with minimal time away from work. I want to approach my boss to see if they're open to supporting me, either by covering the cost, adjusting my workload slightly, or just giving their approval. He's a good boss, but he lacks warmth. And I've just not brought up my career progression goals before. How do I bring this up in a way that shows it's not just for my growth, but will also add value to the team? Any advice on how to frame the conversation or examples of what to say?
Ooh, this is great for you.
Yeah, no, I love this because if I can start with the business problem that I'm going to solve with these skills, how do these skills connect up to an emerging opportunity, a problem that we as a company have where I can actually sort of help that? How will this course actually help close that skill gap that I have, help me develop this important skill? And then how will I express those skills back into solving the problem? So I'm not just learning for the sake of learning, but this is an opportunity for me to sort of actually go contribute and take those skills that I've acquired and actually solve a problem, which is then going to generate the return that I originally sort of, forecasted. I think that's just a critical part of that conversation, in terms of just framing it with that leader.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's perfect.
Exactly. My advice too would be, so what's the company get out of this? Not how do I ask permission? Now, to be fair, for a lot of people, this particular person's issue is, how do I ask permission? Mm-hmm. Right. And what you said was a really, really important. I mean, everybody listening, pay attention here. How is this going to change my ability to impact the business?
Right.
And once you teach yourself how to speak in that way and think in that way, right, then the more likely you are. I mean, who doesn't want to hire a skilled employee? And, the cost of paying for somebody's education is probably way cheaper than paying for somebody who knows how to do it. And sometimes it's a time frame issue. Right. If that course is going to take 4 years, then the ROI might be harder to express. But the idea that you're going to express it in terms of the value that I'm going to add afterwards is right on.
Well, yeah. And I think too often when we're asked as leaders or even in HR about, courses or learning, it doesn't start with the business. It starts with like, I'm interested in this. And if I learn this, it'll be good for me. But there's no tie back to the business. And so starting with that and also asking yourself that question, it also might help you understand whether or not you need to take that course and whether or not the business should pay for it. Because if it's more personal,
right,
then the business shouldn't pay for it. If it's really going to have an impact and an ROI, then of course the business should pay for it. Or it's a conversation at least.
Mm-hmm.
We had so much fun with you.
Yeah, we did.
Yes, likewise.
And congrats on everything, all the books and this book and many more books to come.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. It's I've really enjoyed both writing the book with Tanuj and certainly the various conversations we've had with organizations who are starting to adopt the ideas. And so it's been wonderful so far.
Great. And if our listeners want to find you, where can they go?
So I'm on LinkedIn, Ravin Jesuthasan. My website is ravinjesuthasan.com. And there's also a website for the book where they can download a free excerpt. And that is www.skillspoweredorganization.com.
Perfect.
Great.
Well, thank you so much. We loved it.
Thanks for listening to TruthWorks. This episode was produced and edited by Megan Hayward. Thank you to Kathleen Speckert and the whole Edit Audio team.